My name is Josephine Giaimo, and I'm going to talk about UX strategic leadership in a post-AI VUCA world. And yes, this is a very massive topic. It's going to have some detail in it, but it's also going to be somewhat high level. So, so this talk is going to last from 11:20 to 12:15, and there'll be room at the end for questions and answers. And you can ask a question during the presentation. I have a number of slides, and we'll just go through them. I might skip a couple like that. I've been doing user experience research for a number of years. Most recently, I've been involved as one of the team leads for the local chapter of the User Experience Professionals Association. So how many of you are familiar with the term VUCA? Oh, we have one hand. That's good. Actually, this term comes out of the military. You know, they like to use a lot of acronyms. VUCA stands for volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. So decades ago, people started noticing that with the impact of technology on systems and society, these things just keep accelerating, right? You notice how timelines get compressed, and it seems that everything's happening instantaneously. And there's a lot of dynamics that occur in these multiple systems that we interact with on a minute-by-minute basis. So I know this is a little provocative, but I wanted to kind of get this little piece out of the way here. Last year at the Trenton Computer Festival, I talked about a number of projects that I've been involved in that successfully use non-generative AI to solve problems. Currently, there's a lot of interest and a lot of adoption of generative AI in workplaces, and I'm sure some of you are well familiar with this. I have a lot of concerns about the use of generative AI, and this talk is not about that, but I and others in the field of user experience research believe that the current wave of interest and adoption of generative AI is a temporary one, and I and others are looking forward to what's called the second AI winter. So, but it is going to create opportunities. The use of generative AI in any of a number of well-documented examples that I don't really, we're not going to focus on today. But this proliferation of generative AI will create future opportunities for people in the UX field to address safety issues, ethical issues, legal issues, design issues, research issues, lots of things in the future. So I also wanted to introduce you to some vocabulary. I'm going to talk more about this later, but we use our senses to acquire information and solve problems. And in complex dynamic environments, it's important for us to learn to see, think, act, and feel differently. And you'll see opportunities for where that comes into play later in the talk. There are different types of complexity, social complexity, which requires participation from other human beings who are sense makers. Generative complexity, when things emerge, we need to be mindful of when something new happens, something novel happens. And there is a dynamic tension between exploring things on one hand and what's called exploitation, like maximizing the use of a resource. So these are sort of general themes that apply in today's VUCA environment. Another idea that I wanted to introduce, I know that if you were to take a test on your conflict management style, probably many of you would choose to be conflict avoidant or conflict averse. But in the course Leading Through Complexity that I took recently, I learned that differences, rather than minimizing them, are actually opportunities to have a conversation, achieve change through indirect means. I had to learn to shift my way of dealing with conflict, even though I tend to be pretty eclectic when it comes to conflict management and situations. There are really ways to look at differences of opinion, not as something to be avoided or tolerated, but really as the juice in a system that you can use to help move things to a higher level and to a solution. I also mentioned, I wrote here, the lowest gradient energy always wins. Another way of saying this is that the principle of least human effort applies. So we want to, when we look at a system, what is the solution that requires the least amount of energy? One of the things that I learned in taking this course on complexity is that empirical research shows that when people are working on a complex, thorny, wicked problem, they wind up, if they're successful, they spend a whopping 70% of their time developing a shared understanding. Now, a lot of us who've worked in a variety of areas, including technology, we tend to want to frame the problem as a technical problem rather than a relational problem. And if you remember, like the story of the blind man and the elephant, each of the people holding onto a part of the elephant thinks the elephant has a certain shape, a fan if you're holding onto the ear, a snake if you're holding onto the tail. So a lot of the effort that goes into solving a complex dynamic problem really does involve getting people to a shared understanding. So it might mean sharing a story with a particular person at a particular time. And a lot of the things that we do in organizations and in systems presume that other people have the same understanding that we do. And so this is why so much time is spent developing a shared understanding and why it's so important. Once all the parties involved, regardless of where they are in any hierarchy, develop that shared understanding, then the shared intention and the actions come very easily. If you skimp on the shared understanding step, then you will never get to aligned actions or shared intention. So this is really important. How many of you are familiar with the Cynefin framework? Ah, we have a hand up. We have another hand up. That's really cool. Thank you. Okay. David Snowden developed this framework many decades ago. And this particular slide was developed by David Knoll and Kyle Godby. And basically, this Cynefin framework classifies problems into different classes. Ordered problems are problems that are solved using what might be considered best solutions, and they tend to be not so complex and dynamic. So you might think of like an accounting spreadsheet or something like that as an example of an ordered problem. Then in between ordered and complex problems, there's an area where the line that's up to the right is pointing that are called complicated. So they have aspects of ordered problems and aspects of complex problems. They're called complicated. Sometimes complicated problems, when they're analyzed, they wind up resolving into ordered problems. And sometimes when complicated problems are analyzed, they wind up resolving, so to speak, into complex problems. So the errors can be made in either direction. Sometimes, and I'm sure if you think about it, these kinds of things have happened to you. We can either undersimplify a problem or oversimplify it, right? So when you get to the area of complex problems, you really have to admit that you don't have enough information. You have to collect data, you have to probe and sense before you come up with a response. And a lot of the work that's being done today in organizations is of the complex variety. Because the ordered ones and the complicated ones are easier to solve and have already been solved. And then finally, as we make our way counterclockwise around this diagram, we go into the chaotic domain, which is described as chaotic. The example I like to use is when 9/11 happened. That was really an unprecedented novel event that called for problem solving on your feet as situations emerged. And this slide, I like this slide because it also describes some of the user experience methods associated with finding out more about and solving these types of problems. So what is there to understand about complexity? Well, it occurs in different domains. Let's call them domains. In nature, we see ant colonies and other dynamic systems. In society, we can look at the stock market. In organizations, we can look at the organizational culture. In an individual, we have microbiomes and neural networks. So I'd like to contrast the technical challenges and the complex adaptive challenges. As I said earlier, many of us, because of our training and experience, myself included, tend to frame things as a technical challenge. And I had to unlearn that and relearn how to spot problems that were complex and adaptive as such, We think other people understand the same things we do. And of course, things keep changing. One of the metaphors that David Snowden uses when he talks about complex adaptive challenges is the idea of an estuary. And, an estuary occurs at the mouth of a river. And when there were tides, the brackish water with some salt, then it moves up the river and then back down. So there's no real quote unquote solution because this system is always in dynamic flux. So the best you can hope for in these situations is a kind of a dynamic balance. So some of the strategies that are used for resolving a complex adaptive challenge is to expose, as I was alluding to earlier, expose the complexity. And some of that involves looking at the edge. I know that, many of us have been taught to use probabilistic data, right? But, the people would say things, well, how many children does the average family have? Well, no family has 2.2 children, but those of us who work with people, as many of us do, we know that the edge cases are not just some odd exception, but they're actually illustrative often of a whole segment of, say, population or user group that we haven't really been paying attention to. So there are really important clues in those edge cases. And the way to integrate the complexity of a system is experimenting our way forward. So we take an iterative approach. We collect small amounts of data. We do little tests. And of agile people, people who adopt the agile framework are very much aligned with a lot of David Snowden's work. He talks at many agile conferences. So the way this dynamic works is we understand with our minds, our emotions say something is meaningful, and then our hands do the doing. And when those things are all aligned, there's a lot of velocity. One of the frameworks, again, this is an iterative framework that is used in solving complex adaptive challenges, is the PEARL framework. And PEARL stands for plan, experiment, assess, reflect, and learn. And I could go into more about that, but for now, I just want to paint that concept on the canvas for you. Again, it's an iterative framework. One thing that many people in the UX field emphasize is the collection of stories. And these days, there are more sophisticated software programs to help us collect these stories. I've used this Spring.io narrative collector. I won't go into the details of it. If you want to know more about it, you can check out the Spring.io website, but it's a structure that allows you to collect and reveal the complexity of situations that you're studying. And it is also possible to use lower tech methods. And a lot of people are not familiar with Mural, Miro, or Figure. How many of you are familiar with at least one of those? Okay, we have about half the room. That's great. And this is another lesson that it takes a little time to learn, a little experience, or maybe lifelong experience. Many times people, especially if, you know, they've led projects or led change management teams, they sometimes frame things in technical terms, and they are often tasked with being the expert. But in complexity leadership, the role of the leader is more facilitative, removing obstacles, fostering innovation, driving change, developing relationships, encouraging participation by all of the parties involved. And there's very interesting material that the complexity leader gets to deal with, looking at the larger system, encouraging reflection, and encouraging individuals and teams to be proactive rather than reactive. The persona of a complexity leader includes a strong bias for action, being open to learning from different disciplines, being of service. How can I improve the lives of the users? There's someone wrote a book on servant leadership. I don't remember the name of the person off the top of my head, but there's some really good material just on the concept of servant leadership out there. And then, of course, learning how to influence others, which again requires a kind of a dialogue. The 7-step process for adaptive problem solving starts with the current state, plants a flag in the sand in the future. Then you have to do an assessment of what we can and cannot change, what are our strategic options, develop an agenda, experiment our way forward with little steps, and monitor. So we have to have feedback. Again, where are the hidden networks when you're collecting narratives? A lot of them are, you know, picture an iceberg. You know, the iceberg, maybe 10% of the iceberg is above the water. A lot of the information that you really want is beneath the surface. So it's important to look for that. I want to contrast stories and narratives because a story is, let's say, a story is more local, but narratives are broader. They have maybe more universal implications. So we collect stories and we can also collect narratives. Yes.
What is participatory narrative inquiry?
It's a methodology for collecting stories and narratives.
Is participatory about the practitioner or the person being interviewed?
It's the individuals who are part of the team who is tasked with solving the problem. It could include all the stakeholders and the users as well. And yes, we can think of an organization as a river where, you know, the expression, you can't step into the same stream once. Well, the organization is like a river, and you can dip your ladle into the water and pull out a story, pull out a narrative. And as a facilitator and leader, you can must create conditions where change can occur. And rather than being a direct intervener, your role is to support and assist and ask questions and provide some guidance, but you're not the sage on the stage. And it's important to provide a supportive, trusting atmosphere so people can feel safe to say maybe things that traditionally they were not allowed to say, or maybe they have to guess, or maybe they just need to wonder out loud. A book that some of you may have heard of is The Art of Hosting, which is a great resource if you do want to lead groups and facilitate groups. This is a list of a variety of learning journey techniques. I'm not going to go into all of them, but I wanted to share this list because I find personally that I tend to prefer certain techniques over others and tend to use them over and over again. I think it's good for me and others, to get out of our comfort zones and try a new technique if the situation calls for it. I have used some of these. Not all techniques are created equal, obviously. There are pros and cons to each one, and they're appropriate for different situations. Yeah, David Snowden says, start where people are, not where you would like them to be. That can be challenging, but that's what we got. We need to take the temperature of the group and find out who's on board, who's on the fence, who's resistant. We need to identify what is called in this field adjacent possible moves. So more traditionally, I have one degree in engineering, I was taught linear programming, I was taught, shortest distance from point A to point B, it's a straight line. And in these complex dynamic environments, it's not a straight line, as I'm sure some of you already know. So if we map out some of the spaces where, say, we have our current approach, and we look to the edges of that space, we can identify what are called adjacent possible moves, which are adjacent to the current solution and the current situation. Maybe they require only a small adjustment, but maybe there's a big consequence. And you'll hear the terms more like this, less like that, because it's a nudge. It's not a big change. It's not necessarily linear. It might be lateral or liminal. So here's an example. It's easier to ask people, how do we generate more stories of satisfied customers and fewer stories of unresolved complaints than to just ask them this broad general question, how do we improve customer service? I know that many of you have heard that, many of you have heard that we cannot just simply ask, for example, an end user, what would you like different, or what would you like, or what would you prefer? They're harder asks because they're just too abstract for starters, right? So when we're communicating not just with users, but with other people, who are not users, we can fine tune our ask. We can also focus our energy to determine what we can change. There's a cascade of events that occurs. The system generates results. There are agents within the system that reflect certain path dependencies. There's interaction. The patterns are reflected in the narratives. And then we get to what are called governing constraints, which often are not revealed until we have gotten to like a bedrock of how the system actually works. And sometimes there are dark constraints that we don't even see. So it's important to have this mental model so that when you get into these situations where you're trying to drain the swamp, you know that there are governing constraints, and sometimes they're assumptions. People don't even talk about them. They're the culture. They're embedded in the culture often of an organization. So this author, Alicia Guerrero, says, when everything is ultimately connected to everything else, expecting to isolate one aspect of a problem and by dealing with it, solve the entire problem is a senseless endeavor. Again, this speaks to the slippery, complex quality of dynamic systems. You can map your constraints. I didn't map them here, but if you map your constraints of time and energy, you can actually identify zones and regions. Volatile zones where things can and do change rapidly. Counterfactual zones where there is no change possible. And then opportunity spaces. So if you do this, it's a way of making explicit where the constraints provide the best possibility for success. And if we're going to do continuous discovery, we need experimental probes. Those are actions. I like to sometimes think of all the people in a complex system as individual sensors themselves, because each person has their own point of view. They have a role, they have their own experience. And there are many low-cost, low-risk actions that one can take to get insights. I won't talk much right now about these maps, the assemblage map, the constraints map, and the contextualization map, but I will say that if you create your assemblage map, it'll help you determine your strategy. If you create your constraints map, then you can determine your tactics. And then if you create your contextualization map, you can determine how to execute the plan. I talked a little bit earlier about feedback loops. Feedback loops occur on various levels simultaneously within these complex dynamics. And they range from pre-experiential sequence training, governance models, team coaching models. I'm not going to go into this very much, but the point is that if you picture an organization, I want to give an example. When I worked at the university to get my master's degree, I worked in the finance office. And just as a very small example, I was new to the university. I worked for the controller in the finance office. And I realized very quickly that there were these formal methods for getting things done, and then the informal methods for getting things done. So these feedback loops, whether they're formal or informal or whatever level of granularity you're talking about, there's a lot of dynamism in these organizations. So that's another way of describing these. There is scaling, there's politics, they're all involved. Here's an acronym I wanted to share with you that describes capacities within a system. Trust for sharing, impact for improving, learning so we can adapt, engagement so we can collaborate with each other, and spread, which allows scaling to occur. There's a really great book called The Skill Facilitator by Roger Schwartz, which some of you may have heard of. He talks about how to foster effective team performance. Some of the sample behaviors as a facilitator and leader that we can exhibit include making statements about views, asking actual questions, sharing relevant information. And he uses a mutual learning behaviors model for this. The coaching that is often used by someone who leads through complexity is what's called light coaching. So it's not heavy-handed, it's not directive, not management, it's not micromanagement, it's light coaching, making suggestions. Yes, so in complex systems, we need to uncover the hidden dynamics of change. And it's important, this is another shift that I experienced in my thinking. It's important that we not focus on the individual people in as much as we're not trying to change them, we're not trying to convince them of anything. We focus on the processes of change. We work with the potential of the system as a whole. People have their colon complete and they have their autonomy. And we can use a constraints-based approach. We can look at the relationships and the interactions. We can work in the present. And just as I was talking earlier about edges, cracks like edges are opportunities for transformation. We don't discard them. We rejoice when they occur. And think of the organization as a landscape of possibilities, much broader, much wider, much more expansive. As I've mentioned earlier, human beings are complex, unpredictable, and unique. You might, as a leader, even facilitate a shallow dive into chaos, maybe create an experiment, a what-if scenario, ask people to come together and talk about uncomfortable things. Provide a safe dynamic container. Then we're not going to throw anyone out of the lifeboat. And then as we transition to a continuous model, we become more adaptive. We embrace continuous learning. We adopt resilience thinking. So in today's VUCA-like world, we need resilience more than robustness. So we don't need so much strength and permanence as much as we need flexibility. And you can think of example of different kinds of trees that break in the wind versus trees that bend in the wind. It's important to have a diverse team, one that embraces experiments and tight feedback loops, so people get information sooner rather than later. The example from nature that I like is if you have a body of water with a certain level of phosphorus in it, nature has a way of adjusting and adapting. So in this particular example, as the phosphorus level changed, the sawgrass in the ecosystem was replaced by cattails. So we have this idea of amping and damping. This is a part of what we observe in a dynamic environment. Amping means improving or enhancing. Dampening means removing something or establishing flow. So you can have both of these things happening at the same time. It may seem paradoxical, but you can have both occurring at once. So what do we need to thrive as a complexity leader? We need to help others see the big picture. We need to create safe conditions for transformative change. We need to support others in co-creating a future. So again, a shared understanding is really key. As part of the course that I undertook a project so that I could learn the steps that were being taught. And it really came up against how difficult it was for people to develop a shared understanding, especially, some people more of an interest in certain outcomes than others. People have different understanding of technology. Some people need to use the technology in a different way than others. So it can be very complicated. Yes, it's important to follow the energy and learn to see around corners. I know that sounds a little phantasmagorical, but human beings were designed to do this, so it's all within our capability. Are any of you familiar with Maloney's 16% rule? This rule is associated with technology adoption curves most frequently. And if you look at how technology is adopted, the early adopters, the people who are like gadget freaks, whatever, and the early adopters, they comprise the 16% of adoption. So once you reach that threshold, you have to change up what you're doing, because the people who represent the rest of the adoption curve have different expectations and different needs. That's why you need to change your messaging and your media strategy. For the first 16%, there's a sense of novelty, there's a sense of scarcity. Once you get past that point, now you need to argue with social proof. So, some of the things that we're anticipating as complexity leaders in 2025 is the continued conversation around hybrid and remote work, increased need to learn and adapt as if we already didn't have enough to learn about and adapt to, right? The age of AI, which I mentioned earlier, the age of the metaverse, where we're being bombarded or given access to infinite amounts of information, and then nano learning, which refers to the opportunity to learn about new things not in long courses or master's degrees, but in little snackable chunks, just a few minutes here and there. I'd like to thank my teacher, Randall Rogers. If it weren't for him, I would not be standing in front of you today talking about this.